Have you ever been to the beach in the Pacific Northwest and noticed hundreds of birds gathering? Or maybe you noticed larger than normal numbers of marine mammals like sea lions or seals congregating. Or maybe you were at a Pacific Northwest beach and noticed that the water looked almost a tropical aqua color with large swaths of milky white. Have you ever been to the beach and noticed seaweeds and eelgrass dripping with small translucent eggs? If you answered yes to any of those, chances are high that you witnessed one of the most joyful and hopeful local events, Pacific herring spawning. I got to see the evidence of Pacific herring spawning a couple of weeks ago at Golden Gardens Beach here in Seattle. It was the first time I have seen that many herring eggs on one of our local beaches since 2020, and I had a lot of questions about it. So I reached out to Phil Dionne at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. He very generously agreed to talk with me about the importance of Pacific herring to our local marine ecosystem and how you can help track these events around the Seattle area. So let's dive in to learn some more about the very important Pacific herring. Okay, so thank you, Phil, for agreeing to meet me online and talk to me about Pacific herring. I'm really normally an invertebrate person, but herring have really captured my heart, and I think herring spawning is one of the most joyful and hopeful events that a person can bear witness to. I feel really fortunate that I've gotten to see some of those events here in Seattle. So I really love herring, and I'm hoping you can introduce yourself and tell folks who you are and what you do and why we should care about herring and why they're so important to our marine ecosystem here in the Puget Sound area.
Sure. So my name's Phil Dionne, and I am the lead research scientist for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's forage fish management and monitoring team. And I'm based out of Olympia, but we have staff that are working throughout Puget Sound, some staff based out of Olympia, but also in the Mill Creek office. And we're responsible not only for herring, but also surf smelt and sand lance and other forage fish species, anchovy. So the full suite of species, but herring does take up probably the largest part of our time. It's probably the most important forage fish in Puget Sound. It's one of the species that we have in Puget Sound year round, and Puget Sound has a lot of critical spawning habitat for herring as well. So the one of the main reasons that forage fish are so important in general, and herring in particular, is that they're the piece of the food web that really allows for energy to be transferred from lower level producers and consumers, namely plankton, up the food chain into the higher level consumers such as salmon and rockfish and seals and sea lions and seabirds and even some of the humans that like to eat them. So they're a pretty critical part of the ecosystem, and I'm fond of saying that if we don't have healthy forage fish stocks, we don't have a healthy ecosystem. And all the recovery efforts that are currently underway for species like salmon and orcas just can't be successful without healthy forage fish stocks.
Right. So if you love orcas, you should love herring and
Yes.
forage fish in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So herring, I reached out to you this week because I got to see a beach covered in herring eggs at Golden Gardens, and I was really excited because there were so many eggs, and I haven't seen a beach covered in that many herring eggs, me personally, since 2020 when there was a big spawning event over in West Seattle. And it seems like this spawning event in Golden Gardens was pretty big. Is that correct?
It was relatively large. So big is a relative term for herring spawning events. And my team, what we do is we actually look at the egg density in an area and how much area was covered. And we try to back calculate using a formula that was actually developed by some Canadian researchers back in the 1970s to estimate the tons of herring in an area or that would have been required to spawn in an area to leave that many eggs. We haven't done the math yet because we're still actually just doing surveys today. We usually visit a site multiple times because oftentimes herring will spawn several times over a week to a month.
Hmm.
Um, But based on our early observations, I would say we're probably looking at a spawning event that we would estimate had hundreds of tons of herring spawning, which seems like a lot. But compared to some of the stocks, particularly the Port Orchard, Port Madison spawning area straight across from Elliott Bay, in recent years has had as much as 7,000 tons of herring spawning in that area. So
Wow.
it's several hundred tons is nothing to scoff at, but relative to some of the larger events, it's not one of the larger events.
Okay. So what is the largest of spawning event that we've had like, within the city limits of Seattle? Do you know?
That's a great question. Let me see if I can pull up my table real quick here and give you an actual number. So for as long as we've been monitoring the Elliott Bay area, the largest estimate of spawning biomass that we've recorded is about 380 tons.
Okay. So still small by compared to our neighbors across the way.
Right. Yeah.
Was
And just
it
for, I guess, some frame of reference, the largest spawning events that we've ever recorded, as long as we've been using these methods, would have been in the Cherry Point area back in the 1917s, where we had spawning biomass estimates over 13,000 tons in that area.
wow. That must have been quite something to see. So what is it? So do we have a healthy herring population in Elliott Bay?
Uh, so that's a great question. It's a healthy herring population in the sense that it's continuing to spawn. We've seen it in multiple years, but it's also one of our sort of more interesting populations in that we haven't been monitoring it all that long. So some populations like Cherry Point, we've been aware of and monitoring since the 1970s, and fisheries predated that. We only became aware of spawning in the Elliott Bay area in around 2012. And so we have a relatively short time frame to have learned about that particular stock area or spawning area, I should say. And as a result, we don't really know what healthy is. So it went from zero or unknown. They may have been spawning in that area for years and just been in low enough abundance that we never noticed them.
Hmm.
Um, and as part of that, we have also been surprised sometimes to find them spawning in areas that we're not currently monitoring. So it seems like semi-regularly we will be surprised to get reports like the report you sent to us about spawn showing up in areas that we're not looking. And so we keep expanding our map of areas that we have to survey because of where they keep spawning or expanding to.
So when you say stock, can you explain what that means?
Yeah, and I taught myself. It's a term that I have to be carefully used because stock generally has a more rigid definition. And historically, we've in Puget Sound we considered an area, a group of fish spawning in an area at a particular time as a stock of herring. We're getting away from that a little bit more because there's been some genetics work that shows that many of these fish are related regardless of where they're spawning. And if there is any genetic structure, it appears to be mostly related to when they're spawning. And so they may be more related. The fish I mentioned that are spawning across the way at Port Orchard, Port Madison might be the same fish genetically as the fish that are spawning at Elliott Bay. Um, and so I'm trying to rephrase and focus more on the spawning areas so as to not confuse people.
Okay, that's helpful because I always understood it as stock meaning genetic
Yeah,
relation or lineage, and that if it's the Cherry Point stock was its own, has its own genetic relations, and then ours here, but that may not be the case. It might be that they're related.
right. Yeah, and the Cherry Point stock sort of stands out as one of the unique stocks because it does appear to be genetically distinct from all the other stocks in Puget Sound. It is the latest spawning stock in the region. So it's sort of isolated by time and doesn't seem to spawn with any of the other spawning areas that we monitor.
Okay. So when I got a message from your colleague Erin, and she said that there hasn't been a herring spawn recorded here in LA Bay since 2021. You right?
That's correct.
Okay. So, and then before that, there was definitely one in 2020. So, are you noticing any patterns as far as, they're here every number of years, or is it really irregular when they're here and spawning?
Um, That's so, like I said, we haven't been monitoring them for all that long. And so as a result, we don't have a lot of certainty about that. After we first documented them, it looks like we saw them for about 7 years straight. We were able to find spawn in the area, in the general area of Elliott Bay. Sometimes north or south of where we originally found the spawning, near the sculpture park,
Mhm.
but we've sort of lumped that all together as the same group of fish, just utilizing new habitats, or us catching on to them using that new habitat. The first time we missed them was in 2019, and then, as you noted, 2020 and 21 we had spawning, and then yeah, for the past 3 years we haven't seen anything.
Mhm.
And we'd actually speculated that the fish might have just moved to a different area because we saw during that same time frame some spawning in other areas that was somewhat unique, but similar in time to the spawning that we had seen in the Elliott Bay area. And so we can't say for sure. As I mentioned, the genetics doesn't really give us the opportunity to say which fish are which. So it could just be that those fish chose a different area, and we detected them, but maybe lumped them with another group of fish because they were spawning closer to another spawning area, or they spawned in an area that we weren't monitoring at a low enough density that we didn't detect it or the public didn't notify us about it.
Okay. And so when you're talking about surveying these specific sites, does that mean that every year at a certain time that folks from your department go out and specifically look for activity and eggs?
Yeah, so our survey methods are what we call we're doing egg deposition surveys, but we call them just rake surveys because essentially what we're doing is we go along the shoreline in areas where we either suspect spawning has occurred or may occur, or we have historic evidence of spawning in the past, and we drag a vegetation grapnel, which is just a two-sided rake,
Mhm.
along the bottom to collect some of the vegetation that the herring will spawn on. And then we identify the vegetation and identify any eggs that are on them and the density that those eggs were deposited in. And using the area and that density, we back calculate to the number of fish that might have spawned there.
Oh,
And
okay.
we have roughly 21 different areas throughout Puget Sound that we monitor on an annual basis. And we start monitoring as early as, well, typically the first week of January, but this year we had some spawning happening in December, so we're likely going to start earlier. And our last spawning area can spawn as late as mid-June. And
Mhm.
so from late December through early June, we have up to 5 different groups surveying throughout Puget Sound, trying to document where these eggs are.
So in the Seattle area, is there a time frame for that in spawning normally occurs here?
Yeah, so thus far we've documented that Elliott Bay spawning area is typically having spawn in late March through early to mid-April.
Okay.
So it's sort of on the late end of our mid season. So
Okay.
a lot of the most of our peak spawning is typically around March,
Mhm.
um, late February through early April. But so this is sort of on the latter half of that.
Okay. How dependent are you all on community reports from folks in the community reporting out to you that they've noticed something?
I'd say that we've become more and more dependent on the reports from the public. So um, for it, particularly since around 2020, when we had one of the largest spawning events that we've ever recorded, we saw quite a bit of expansion and shifts in spawning areas and some shifts in spawn timing as well. And as we've had to cover more areas for a longer period of time, it's really stretched our staff thin. And so we have to prioritize when and where we do surveys. So even within known spawning areas, it's a great help when people tell us that they're observing what we call either whitewater events, which is a mass spawning event, which will actually turn the water a milky white color or turquoise. Um, or they're actually finding eggs. So that allows us to really target our efforts in the areas where we know spawning is occurring. But also, A lot of these areas have never been documented spawning before, so they're not on our radar and we may not be surveying them. And so without reports from the public, we miss them entirely. And then also there's areas that, because of infrastructure that's in the area, we can no longer survey those areas effectively with our current methods. And so sometimes we get reports from marinas or aquaculture installations of herring spawn on their equipment. And we can't collect that material. So without those reports, we wouldn't be able to document that spawning either.
So it sounds like the herring might be spawning on any surface. Is that true?
Uh, it's yes and no.
Okay.
So they do seem to have preferred spawning substrate. Eelgrass, interestingly, sargassum, which is a non-native species, has a lot of surface area, and so they seem to really like that. We will sometimes collect vegetation samples, and we'll have spawn on one material and no spawn on another material in the same sample. So there does seem to be some selectivity. But we also see is if they are trying to spawn in an area and there's limited substrate, they'll try to spawn on what they have available. So, some of the unfortunate things we've observed as examples where there might be a marina that there's no longer any vegetation in the area, but there's creosote piles, and they'll spawn all over those creosote piles. And unfortunately, the creosote's not any good for the eggs. And so we have like 100% egg mortality. So there's no survival in those instances. And so we prefer to see natural substrate for them to spawn on. But yeah, we do find eggs on man-made materials as well.
Interesting. Yeah, it was interesting to see at Golden Gardens, most of the eggs were on eelgrass. But in 2020, over in West Seattle, they were mostly on sargassum because there's not as much eelgrass in that particular area as there is sargassum. So it's
Right.
interesting. Um, so if another question about the eggs and their viability, if I noticed at Golden Gardens that there were a lot of loose eggs and a lot of eggs end up in the sort of the rack line, the high tide line. So will those eggs survive? I mean, it seems like when I went back this past week, I saw eyeballs and little movement in those eggs that were kind of in the high tide line. So it made me think maybe some of them do survive up there.
Some of them might survive, but to be honest, there's probably a much lower survival rate on those eggs that get washed up on the beach.
Okay.
Um, Unlike some of the other species of forage fish like surf melt and sand lance, which have eggs that are more or less designed to be left on the beach. So when the tide comes and goes, those eggs are left high and dry as the tide's out. And then when they're submerged, they'll hatch and do fine. Herring eggs aren't quite as robust as those, and they're more susceptible to getting smothered and when they're piled up on the beach or getting preyed upon by seagulls and other predators that might come along and try to gobble them up on the beach. So it's not ideal to have them washing up on the beach. We prefer to see them anchored someplace in the lower subtidal or intertidal or subtidal areas.
Got it. Okay. So, how can people help you all to let you know that they've noticed something? What are they going to look for out when they're out on the beach during the months of late March to mid-April?
Yeah, so eggs are an obvious one. There's a few other species that lay eggs around the same time of year that look a little bit like herring eggs, but like the picture behind you, you're not going to see that type of egg concentration with any other species.
Okay.
And the most commonly probably misidentified species that looks similar would be tube snout.
Mm.
But they generally lay their eggs in little clumps, and whereas herring will be more broadly distributed. And tube snout eggs come in a variety of colors. They're actually really, really cool to see. We see them pretty regularly during the herring surveys. But other than that, the herring sort of are visible to the naked eye, so people can see those. But generally, the eggs are going to be below the water line in most cases. And so really what we expect to see is either these whitewater events I described before, where herring are spawning in mass, and so the milt is actually tinting the water to sort of a teal or a milky white color. And associated with this will generally be a lot of predator activity. And so when there's a lot of herring spawning, we'll generally see sea lions, seagulls, harbor seals, sometimes harbor porpoises, which will be feeding directly on the spawning herring. But we'll also see a lot of egg predators. Things like surf scoters will come in and be feeding on the eggs as well, and they'll persist even after the spawning event. You'll see them diving in areas where there's been recent spawning. Um, and so we really appreciate any reports that we can get of this type of activity. And we've actually set up an email specifically for this purpose, and it's a pretty easy one to remember. It's actually just herring@dfw.wa.gov. So if you send an email to that, my staff is monitoring that, and we'll get that. And what we ask for ideally is that we'd like to, if you can send us pictures, because sometimes there's things that look like whitewater events, and we can usually take a critical eye and say, that might just be some runoff or something like that. That's not quite what we're looking for. But if it is what appears to be a spawning event, we'll prioritize that area and try to get our team out there. But photos are fantastic, and GPS coordinates are critical. And then also when you observed it, so that we know how much time we have to get out there. Because herring eggs hatch only after about 2 weeks. So we really only have a narrow window, about a 2-week window from the spawning event to get out there and actually document them. And the longer we wait, the more predation occurs on those eggs. And so our density estimates are actually depreciating over that time frame. So we like to get it out there shortly after the spawning event is complete. So the sooner we get that information, the better.
Okay. Excellent. I have one more question for you. Someone was asking me about the eggs on eelgrass, and does that affect the health of the eelgrass, having them covered up in herring eggs?
I have never had that question before. It's a great question.
Yeah.
I honestly couldn't say.
Okay.
I don't know if it impacts the health of the eelgrass. I know that there is some damage that comes to the eelgrass when eggs are present because of predation. Some of the diving birds will pull out full stalks of eelgrass in their effort to retrieve the herring eggs, and so it's not uncommon to find more eelgrass floating around the surface, some of it with eggs on it, as a result of the bird predators trying to get the eggs. So sometimes they'll even uproot the eelgrass.
That makes a lot of sense. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you answering all of my questions, and hopefully folks will learn how amazing herring are and love them and report out any activity they see in our area, or or around the Salish Sea.
Great. No, we appreciate the interest and all the reports.
Yeah. Thank you again to Phil for talking with me. Let's take a look at what you can look for when you're out on the beach. There are lots of fish eggs you might encounter that are not herring eggs, and here's some examples. Tube snout eggs are probably the closest lookalikes, especially since they're often on eelgrass and seaweeds, but they have a pretty distinctive pinkish hue that's different from herring eggs. And here are some examples of what herring eggs look like. They're whitish to translucent in color, and they're pretty distinctive when you see them out there. As a reminder, you can look for whitewater, that teal or white colored water that looks milky, often accompanied by unusually high predator activity, including birds and marine mammals. And then after the spawning, you might encounter eggs on the beach. So community science starts with you. So don't forget to share any reports of herring spawning around Puget Sound with the Department of Fish and Wildlife at herring@dfw.wa.gov. There are resources listed below this video, including more information about our beloved Pacific herring, so make sure to check them out. I will leave you with a little footage I took just about 2 weeks after the most recent spawning event of a baby herring that had recently hatched out of their egg home. Thanks as always for being here with me, and don't forget to subscribe.